Alright, this week we're looking at the last section of our mind-body problem unit in our Intro to Philosophy course, and we're looking at what philosophers over the ages have had to say about personal identity. And since it's a philosophical topic, you can almost preface it with the problem of personal identity, just like you can, any other topic philosophers look at will usually be prefaced with the problem of. And as you can see, there will be some puzzles or conceptual issues raised by this issue. So it's worth doing some review, though, since we've covered a lot of content the past few weeks. So the traditional mind-body problem is concerned with the relation of the mental to the physical. And two answers with different burdens have traditionally been offered. And this is review, by the way. So the first is dualism. Recall that dualists hold that there are two kinds of stuff. Physical, extended, bodily stuff spread out in space, and this non-physical mental stuff, like our mind. And the burden of the dualist is to explain how this non-physical stuff can interact with the physical stuff, and how it can be intimately related to a single human person. Well, materialism is the thesis that there's only one kind of stuff. Physical stuff. So everything that exists is just stuff that's extended, spread out in space. And the materialist has a different burden. They don't have to explain the unity of the human person or how like two different kinds of stuff interact. Instead, their burden is to explain how the mental can be reducible to matter. So basically, if you're a materialist, the nature of the mental must be explained in purely physical terms. Well, there's, as mentioned, a separate, related, and equally important topic. Recall a question I asked a few weeks ago at the beginning of this unit on the mind and body problem. The question was, when you die, what happens to you? Yes, you. Well, your answer to this question depends on what you are. All right? So, just, what happens to what depends on what it is, okay? So, a dualist might have a pretty plausible answer. Or at least they have plausible reasons to hold that it is possible that you survive if you are a non-physical mind. Because if your mind is distinct from your body, then perhaps when your body dies, your mind can still survive. Alright? So your mind, being non-physical, doesn't have to go out of existence when your physical body dies and changes from, a fully functioning human body into a corpse. The materialist, they're more likely to be committed to you not surviving. So if your mind's reducible to, or just a byproduct of your physical body, then, well, when your body goes, your mind goes with it. Which, so if, some people might take that as bad news, if materialism is true. Well, notice that both the dualists and the materialists' answers depend on part, largely, on what they take you to be. And this leads to the problem of personal identity. And it's a topic within philosophy that seeks an answer to the question, when am I? So, when we're speaking about personal identity, the type of identity that we're going to be discussing is what philosophers call numerical identity. One way to understand what philosophers mean by numerical identity is to contrast it with qualitative identity. What do I mean by that? Well, I want to explain the difference between numerical and qualitative identity with a story. So, suppose that Timmy's dog Lassie dies, and with tears streaming down Timmy's face, he asks his father, "Dad, why see Lassie again when I go to heaven?" Here's a bad answer. Well, Timmy's father replies, "Well, Timmy, when you go to heaven, there will be a dog that smells, looks, and behaves just like Lassie. It'll even have that splotch of white fur on her belly. The dog answers to the name Lassie. Further, the dog will have memories of you implanted in it by God, so that that dog will recognize you. You won't be able to tell the difference between Lassie in heaven and Lassie on earth." Alright, is that a good answer? Would that be a comfort to a kid? Well, I'm going to say no, that was a bad answer. Timmy didn't ask his dad if there would be a dog in heaven that is a lot like Lassie. I mean, for like, a clone or a duplicate or a copy. Timmy wanted to know if his own pet Lassie, that very same dog that he was playing with and who rescued him from a well, Timmy wants to know if that dog will be in heaven waiting for him. Not a copy, okay? Just like if you wanted to buy the original Declaration of Independence that our forefathers signed, you would want that very document. Not even a perfect molecule for molecule duplicate made by a duplicating machine. No, you would want the very one that the forefathers signed. Okay? So this is the difference between qualitative and numerical identity. We take it seriously with like artwork, for example. We want authentic pieces of art. We want the original piece that Leonardo da Vinci painted, not a duplicate that a really good artist made that looks exactly like it. Okay? So that's the difference between qualitative identity and numerical identity. Here's another example, just to illustrate this more. This is an important distinction, so it's good to give as many examples as possible. Oh, I have an email. So suppose Timmy gets beaten by a rabid dog and doesn't get the vaccine in time. So his neurological symptoms start showing. He's fearful of water. By the way, I had a bat in my apartment last winter, and that sucked. I didn't get the rabies vaccine. The fact that I'm still alive says I guess I didn't need to, but man, that was stressful. All right, only 1% of them carry rabies, but still. So anyways, Timmy gets bitten by a rabbit dog and doesn't get the vaccine in time. So he's laying in his deathbed at the hospital, and he looks to the nurse and says, "Nurse, when I die, will I go to heaven to live?" Well, the nurse, not being the best at comforting children, might respond, "Well, Timmy, when you die, God will create a person in heaven who looks and acts just like you. God will also implant memories in this person of everything you've ever seen. So this person will go by your name, Timmy, and this person will like everything you like, your favorite pie, for example, and hunting squirrels. So when you die, Timmy, there will be a person in heaven just like you. Why, if I were to meet this person, I wouldn't even be able to tell the difference between him and you." Again, that's a terrible answer. That's not at all reassuring. The nurse hasn't answered Timmy's question. It's no comfort that there will be a copy of Timmy in heaven or a duplicate. That's consistent with Timmy on earth going out of existence and never coming back into existence. Instead, just a clone goes into existence. That doesn't mean that Timmy will survive death, though. So, that's the end of Timmy's stream of consciousness. So that answer would not be any comfort to a dying Timmy, or me, or I'm going to guess you either. So this leads to that important distinction I'm trying to draw between qualitative identity and numerical identity. Lassie in heaven, in the story I've told, would be qualitatively identical to Lassie on earth, but not necessarily numerically identical. Timmy in heaven would be qualitatively identical to Timmy on earth, but not necessarily numerically identical. That's because just because two things are qualitatively identical, it does not mean that they are numerically identical. All right, so some more examples just to kind of illustrate this point. Take two iPhones that are the exact same model and also have the exact same data installed. So it's like you could duplicate your own iPhone. All your contacts, all your text messages, all your bookmarks, all your pictures, all your music, all your games, your high score on Angry Birds. It's on both iPhones. You can't tell the difference between the two. In fact, they had the same serial number printed on them, okay? So you couldn't tell them apart. Well, so then we would say that they are qualitatively identical. However, they cannot be numerically identical. Why? Well, for one thing, there's actually two iPhones. If the iPhones were numerically identical, then if you were to count them, you would only count one iPhone. So the mere fact that there is two means that there is not one. And that's why it's called numerical identity, by the way. That's the numerical aspect of numerical identity. And we can generalize this, all right? So I've used all these examples with Lassie and Timmy and artwork and iPhones. So we'll generalize this now to a principle. For any x and any y, if x is numerically identical to y, then the number of entities referred to in the list, x, y, is 1. All right? So x and y are variables. That can stand for anything. Ducks, bathtubs, alligators, persons, books, whatever. And the point is, if x and y are numerically identical, then a list of things with x on it and y on it, only one thing is referred to by all the things on the list. Here's an example. The number of persons referred to in the list, first President of the United States and George Washington, is 1. Because it just so happens that the first President of the United States is George Washington. So the first President of the United States is numerically identical to George Washington. That's what we mean by numerical identity. If you were to count the things in that list referred to, it'd only be 1. Alright, well, how does this relate to the question of survival? Well, going back to this survival question, we're not interested in whether or not there can be something qualitatively indistinguishable from you when you die. Instead, we want to know if you can survive, if the person post-death is numerically identical to the person pre-death. Our goal then is to spell out the conditions under which it is true that some person X is numerically identical to some person Y. And we're going to call this the identity criteria for persons. And this is what we're on the hunt for right now, is this criteria, okay? We all know it's true that there is some identity criteria out there. We have all persisted through time. What we want to do is find out what that is. What explains why me now is identical to me yesterday, okay? Well, in other words, what makes it the case that the actor who played Opie on the Andy Griffith Show is numerically identical to the actor who played Richie on Happy Days, who also just happens to be numerically identical to the narrator of the show Arrested Development, which you haven't seen, you should right now after you watch this lesson, but after you, well, of course, do your homework and, study hard. Maybe on Sunday or on Saturday, okay, on the weekend. But watch that show, all right? Okay, so how can it be the case then? We'll just take this as a basic datum. This guy is that guy is that guy, all right? We know that. Ron is Richie is Opie. Those are the same 3 people. It's just that that's Ron Howard as a grown-up. This is Ron Howard as a teenager. And this is Ron Howard as a kid, all right? What we want is the explanation for why this is that, all right? That's what we're seeking right now. So how can it be the case that the actor who played Opie is identical to the actor who played Richie, who just happens to be identical to Ron Howard? Well, why is this a puzzle? Well, there's several reasons. First, let's go back and look at this slide. The actor who played Opie is small, okay? Doesn't have facial hair, voice is really high, pretty short. And then this actor who plays Richie, voice is a little bit deeper, is taller. And then there's this Ron Howard guy. Well, this guy's bald, looks older, probably a little bit heavier, middle-aged, okay? There's a lot of qualitative differences between these 3 people. So we say these 3 things are numerically identical, even though they're qualitatively different in many ways. So again, why is it the case that these 3 guys are identical? That's what we're hunting for. It's an explanation for why that is true. And we're going to assume, by the way, that it is true. So an assumption throughout this lecture and throughout this week is that this is that is that. We're not going to question that initially, okay? Instead, it's just like we assume that things, when you let go of them, fall to the ground, okay? We all know that when you let go of heavy objects, they fall to the ground. What we want is an explanation for why that happens, okay? All right. Well, what we're looking for then are like the essential properties, as philosophers would say, of Ron Howard the person. Ron Howard has undergone many changes through time, yet we say that something has persisted through those changes, such that, well, blah, 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 such that, Ron equals Ron equals Ron. All right. So then the problem of personal identity in part is specifying how someone can persist through time and remain the same. What those properties are that must remain if that person is to be identical through time. And when we're discussing persistence through time, by the way, this is what philosophers call diachronic identity. It's a fancy term. Dia means through and chronos means time. Change, identity through time. Okay? That's literally what it means. By the way, we all change. You all have grown. We lose. Cells die in our bodies every day. We're constantly gaining and losing parts. Yet we are the same. Alright? So before we as I said, we're going to spend most of this week looking at persons. But before we look at persons, though, it's worth looking at one more philosophical puzzle. It's like a philosophical riddle that has, gotten philosophers' attention for thousands of years, and it's time for me to introduce it to you. All right, so take a ship built by Theseus, who's an old sailor. Theseus takes the ship on long voyages to sail the seas. When he arrives at shore, he always performs any repairs necessary to keep the ship seaworthy. This basically involves replacing old planks of wood with newer planks of wood. Well, over time, Theseus replaces every single plank of wood with a new plank, and he stores the old planks in his brother's garage. So this is a pretty plausible story. In a modern day context, it'd be like a car, where you gradually replace all the parts of the car as they go bad with better working parts, all right? If you drive old cars, you probably had to do that. Eventually your transmission goes out. Eventually you need new spark plugs. Eventually you need a new fuel filter. Eventually you might need a whole new engine or whatever. So Theseus is doing that with his ship, but he's only doing one part a year. Okay. Well, one day Theseus's brother Stephen takes all of the old planks of wood from Theseus's garage, and based on a blueprint that Theseus left behind, Steve assembles all the planks into a working ship. It's faded and chipped, but it's actually seaworthy. It sails. It doesn't sink. Well, then here's a question for all of you philosophy students. Which ship is Theseus' original ship? Is it the ship that Theseus is currently sailing on the high seas, which we'll call S1? Or is it the ship Stephen assembled from the old planks? We'll call it S2. Well, some will say it's S1, others will say it's S2. Both answers are plausible, but we need a principled answer for why it can be S1 or S2. We need some criterion. That's what we're hunting for. Here's a non-starter. It can't be that both S1 and S2 are identical to the original ship, because there was one original ship, not two. And we're asking about which ship is numerically identical to the original ship. And it's not logically possible that both S1 and S2 be numerically identical to the original ship, because then the number of things referred to would be 2, not 1. Remember? And that violates what numerical identity is. Well, there's another answer we want to avoid. We don't want to say that neither S1 or S2 is the original ship. Of course, it's at least logically possible, but it's still a suspect answer. Because basically, are we to say that there were actually 3 ships in the story we just told instead of 2? Well, what happened to the third ship? Did it just disappear? That's kind of baffling itself. Well, this leads to 2 different criteria of diachronic identity. The first criterion is what we'll call the substance criterion, and they would say that the old plank ship S1 is the original ship. And the reason why is because it's made out of the original parts that the original ship was made of. S1 is made out of the same parts that the original ship was made out of. Therefore, S1 is the original ship. That's what the substance criterion says. Okay. Again, the substance criterion of diachronic identity says that X is identical to Y if X and Y are made out of the same stuff. So the old plank ship S1 is the original ship because it's made out of the same parts. And this has got some intuitive appeal. So one way we can move a ship is to just disassemble it, move it, and then reassemble it. Carnivals do it all the time. So does NASA. All you aeronautical engineers at Purdue, you know how NASA transports really large spacecraft to launch pads. They disassemble it, ship it, and then reassemble it. Okay? But you'd say it's the same shape. The ship that left Houston's the same ship that arrived in Florida. Okay? I race mountain bikes, and sometimes I have to take apart my bikes when I'm flying somewhere and then reassemble them whenever I land. It's still the same bike, okay? And this is what happened with Theseus' original ship. The only difference is that it was slowly disassembled over several years instead of all at once. But it's not the process that matters, it's the end result. And the end result is a ship composed of the very same planks that Theseus used. And again, we're going to call this the substance criterion. The criterion by which we judge identity over time is simply in terms of the stuff making it up. Well, there's another criterion, though, that we should explore. We're going to call this the continuity criterion. And this would say that the new plank ship, S2, is the original ship. And here's some motivation to it. It's obvious that we have Theseus' ship in the beginning? Well, what happened is simply that something was done to it. You replaced one plank on the ship, but that doesn't mean that the ship disappears. Just like if you replace the oil filter on your car, it's not like you have a new car. Or if grandpa gets a new hip, you don't get a new grandfather. Alright? It's the same grandfather it always was. So, all we have to do then is track Theseus' ship over time, from the time it is assembled until now. And we should find a clear line through space-time that we can track. And whatever that is, then the relationships between those space-time points is kind of what secures the identity of the ship and makes S2 identical to the original ship. Well, we're going to call this the continuity criterion. Well, I note though that both of these criterion cannot be true, but they're both, well, plausible for their own reasons. They both have a basis in common sense about how we think about material objects. And they're not mere opinions. They have principled support. So in the next two lectures then, we're going to relate these criteria back to personal identity, and we're going to look at dualist as well as materialist answers.